Welcome back. In the last class, we talked about the importance of cultural democracy as a philosophy, and we tried to look at how cultural democracy has fundamentally changed our perspective, our understanding of cultural policy itself, and how cultural democracy, the idea of cultural democracy, insisted upon the idea that many cultural traditions coexist in human society, and it is therefore um, the responsibility of the state to ensure that none of these cultures uh, dominate over the others, and none of these cultures become the official culture of a state or of a nation. So, this is the idea of cultural democracy. As you can see, it was a very inclusive concept, and it's related to the idea of democracy itself, and uh, it, it's also related to the idea of cultural rights of community, and it also basically celebrates um, the idea of difference. In contrast to this, cultural democracy um, looks down upon the tendency to treat um, other communities as being culturally inferior to one's own, right? So this tendency is, of course, something that doesn't go well with the philosophy of cultural democracy at all. We talked about the white man's burden in the last class, and that, of course, reflects an attitude of cultural superiority or ethnic superiority of the Europeans over the others. But the same is also reflected in different ways today. I mean, a lot of crisis, a lot of the conflicts that are happening around the world today has to do with this, the lack of this belief in cultural democracy, the lack of faith in cultural democracy, uh, to the unwillingness to accept um, diversity as a way of life. And conversely, just thinking of diversity as a problem which has to be eradicated or which has to be removed, and the earlier the better. Now, today we will look at some of the features of cultural democracy, three features of cultural democracy um, specifically, and these are very, very important characteristics of cultural democracy. Let's try to understand these. I have, in a way, already addressed some of these in whatever we have discussed, but I'm going to be more specific about it now. So remember, we are now going to talk about three dimensions or three features of cultural democracy. Number one, instead of eliminating diversity, cultural democracy believes in the inclusiveness of cultures. Cultural democracy believes in the inclusiveness of cultural diversity. So it seeks to maximize the sort of inclusiveness of diverse traditions, even within the same culture. Um, Generally, the tendency to is to homogenize cultures. No, when we talk about one culture, we do not even consider the possibility that there could be many traditions that lie hidden even within one single culture. Forget about accepting cultural diversity on a wider scale. Even within the same community, very often we see that there are different traditions that make a particular culture. Uh, we have to begin with that. We have to be inclusive of all those diverse traditions that uh, belong to a particular culture. So the idea is not to allow preconceived bias, reflect on our selection of traditions from within a culture that deserve to be protected and encouraged. So we have a particular idea in our mind that this particular place or this particular culture stands only for this tradition, and so everything else we obliterate. Everything else that doesn't fit the bill in our image, uh, we remove that completely. This should not be the case. Uh, as students of cultural democracy, as students of cultural policy, as students of cultural studies, we have to be very particular about valuing the ethos of multicultural, pluralistic society and highlight the importance of mutual respect for each other. So, just want to give you an example of what we are talking about here. We think about the case of Marjuli, for instance. We talk about Marjuli, the tendency generally is only to think about it in terms of the place being the seat of Vaishnavite culture, which obviously it is. And that way, of course, it's tremendously important. And that's one of the major reasons why Madhuli has become such an interesting um, place to be in. And we have so many foreign tourists coming to that place. I mean, to get a glimpse of Vaishnavite culture, and particularly the kind of culture that is still being practiced in the monasteries or the satras out there. So that's very important. But as students of cultural studies, as students who are now aware of the philosophy of cultural democracy, we should be aware of the other traditions also that form the heritage of Madhuri, right? And in that regard, we have to accept the fact that this is not the Vaishnavite culture is not the only one. There are other cultures as well that constitute the heritage of Madhuri. So all of these we should be included, or we should be sensitive to it. Um, all of these other traditions that make up the culture of Madhuri. This is the first point. Secondly, cultural democracy highlights the idea of greater participation in cultural activity. So everyone should be free to freely, participate in the culture or cultures of his or her choosing. If I may choose to belong to many cultures at the same time, that's up to me to decide. And so far as I'm concerned, I should be able to freely participate in all these cultures that I believe in or that I have a respect for. Thus, the idea of right to culture should be focused. Cultural right, that is what we talked about in the first class. Remember, I mean, this is something that's very, very important for cultural democracy. It could also mean greater focus on the right to free expression. Um, so, practicing my culture includes the right to free expression of my cultural behavior, and no one should come in the way of that. So, this is another respect of cultural democracy. This is another important feature. Thirdly, uh, cultural democracy also implies greater access to the means of expression of culture uh, to communities. In the present age, in this regard, access to uh, electronic media, say for instance, is vital in this regard. How does one express one's cultural behavior? How does one uh, spread one's culture across communities or beyond one community. In this regard, one also needs access to electronic media. And this, again, the state should facilitate greater access to the media, particularly of the electronic media of all the communities. So, um, another point that we would like to highlight today is how democratic participation in cultural life has been enriched today by the power of technology, right? So this is a very, very important concept in cultural policy, the idea of democratic participation in cultural life, and how this has been encouraged by the coming of technology, by the power of technology. But at the same time, we should also look at the flip side. I mean, we should also look at how the same technology can also, um, in a way, be detrimental for culture in the long run. So, what is the role of technology in facilitating cultural life, and also at the same time, what role does it play, if at all, in jeopardizing or the cultural life of a community, or how does it threaten the cultural life of a community? Let us try to understand this idea today. The power of technology is amazing. I think all of us accept this. There is no disagreement about this anymore. There's hardly any aspect of life today which is not impacted by technology. On the one hand, uh, technology can provide greater access to communities to uh, express their respective cultures, and we are all reaping the benefits of this. Cultures that no one even knew that existed um, are today expressing themselves in the social media, in the electronic media, and we are all reaping the benefits of technology. But as I said, technology can also jeopardize people's participation in cultural life. So this is what we need to be concerned about, and cultural policymakers also need to be very, very sensitive about this issue. Uh, say, in many ways, today, I don't think it makes a lot of sense for us to understand how technology is helping and spread our cultures today. I think this is this is understood. All of you are aware of how technology is playing a big role that cannot be exaggerated in terms of its importance of spreading um, culture across society. But let us look at the flip side of technology. Let us look at how technology is also hurting the cause of culture. In many ways, today we see that the mass media encourages individualism. It discourages, indirectly, of course, people from participating in community cultural life, isn't it? I mean, instead of going to take part in a community festivity, or in going to take part in a community activity, most people would today rather be confined to the private space of their own laptops, or the private space of their own television. So it has made us more and more individualistic. So we are moving away from a community life, and we have more and more, uh, we are increasingly moving towards the private worlds of entertainment, which is being provided to us uh, through the through television, and more increasingly by the internet. So we become more and more limited to the pressings of our own private worlds. So instead of going out to take part in a community festival, say like Bihu or something, most people today would probably prefer to stay indoors, because apparently that's also safer to be away from people. That is what we are taught. That's very unfortunate, of course. But we remain confined to our own, living rooms. So there's a detrimental effect of culture. And now television and the internet, particularly the news media, they focus on conflicts, they focus on natural and man-made disasters all the time. I see most of the time the news is about that. It's about conflicts, it's about uh, wars, it's about the disasters that we face almost on a daily basis today. And um, as you know, we seem to be entering more and more dangerous forms of violence with each day. So these forms, these conflicts, or these disasters are all reduced to a spectacle by the media, and they reinforce a sense of individual alienation and powerlessness. You feel helpless. You feel that you are alienated from others. You feel that you cannot do anything to change the system. You're so powerless. You are so fragile. You are so alienated, so cut off from others. So basically, there is indirectly an encouragement for people to move away from being active agents in, control of their own lives. We, you know, think about it. I think this is very important for students, particularly, to understand the way in which technology um, has encouraged greater and greater alienation of people from each other, and it has prevented us from being active agents in who are in control of our own lives. We are no longer in control of our own lives because our lives are decided by, are shaped by all these things, all the spectacles that are happening around us, and we seem to be absolutely powerless in the face of these conflicts and these disasters. So, what do you do? There's nothing for you to do but to just be a couch potato, as they say. Just spend your time lying down in the couch and imagining yourself in this situation, from which there is nothing, no way in which you can escape. So this in turn, makes democratic participation in cultural life more and more difficult. Democracy requires vibrancy. Democracy requires active participation of its members. Technology has somehow come to alienate us from each other, and this has become increasingly the case. This is very, very important, particularly in the context of cultural democracy, and when you think about how our cultural lives have been uh, increasingly uh, devastated, in fact, by the coming of these newer and newer forms of technology. So, democratic participation in cultural life means that cultural life itself should be subject to democratic control. Communities need to have a greater say in controlling the direction of the cultural life of the community. We're losing that control. We no longer have any say about which way our cultural lives are headed. We may raise a lot of hue and cry about the authenticity of culture, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, we see that there is an increasing, um, moving away from there's a greater and greater movement away from participation in cultural life. And there are public cultural issues that should ideally concern all of us, but not many people, unfortunately, have a lot to say about this. We should have a say about uh, how we are educated and what we are taught, and what kind of facilities are are made available to us. What kind of cultural institutions and art works are supported or need to be supported, or even um, how our political system works. But uh, technology has seemed to cut us farther and farther away from this. If we have to keep culture alive and vibrating, we should ensure greater, agency for the people. Unless there is agency for the people, um, democracy is meaningless. And we should be able to protect and sustain culture. The true sense of the word. Culture is not synthetic. Culture is not something that you protect as a token. Culture is so integrally connected to each and every aspect of our life. You cannot protect culture alone if the feet under your ground is sinking. Right? It's connected to every other aspect of your life. This, I believe, is the key question. That is where technology is a big threat. Just as it has, of course, also facilitated um, the the span of culture, the range of culture, it is also in some ways, I believe, and this is another important point, it has in many ways also dissociated culture from its roots. It is decontextualized culture. This for me is a dangerous proposition because in that sense you can only make culture um, um, make use of culture instrumentally. I mean, you cannot really use it to increase, the active participation of people in democratic life. And that, for me, is the key question. So, in order to do this, we must also understand that different aspects of culture are related to uh, economic and political factors. And therefore, remember, we cannot think of culture in isolation. Right? Thank you. So, in the next class, we will move on to some other aspects of cultural policy.